In this documentary, we will explore a surprising and little-known aspect of daily life in medieval Europe: the art, science, and hard labor of washing clothes in an era without machines, without plumbing, and without the modern chemicals that we consider commonplace today. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine an ordinary morning in a 14th century European city. The sun has barely dawned over the thatched and tiled roofs, and the sound of water being poured into large wooden tubs can already be heard. On the banks of a river, women carry heavy baskets on their backs, and the rhythmic sound of wooden bats hitting wet fabric echoes through the valley. This is not a strange ritual or a scene of punishment. It is quite simply a laundry day, a day that demanded physical strength, rudimentary chemical knowledge, hours of uninterrupted work, and a considerable dose of courage. For us, inhabitants of the 21st century, laundry is a domestic task that barely requires attention. We put the clothes in the machine, add detergent, press a button, and return 45 minutes later to take them out. The process is so automated that we often postpone it out of pure laziness, accumulating piles of dirty clothes in the corners of rooms without any sense of urgency. But there was a time when washing clothes was not just a task, it was an event, a journey, and for many, women, an entire profession. And perhaps, by understanding what it meant to keep clothes clean 700 years ago, we can look at our washing machines with a renewed sense of gratitude. The starting point for understanding medieval laundry is to dispel a persistent myth deeply rooted in the popular imagination: the idea that people in the Middle Ages lived in permanent filth, indifferent to hygiene, wrapped in filthy and smelly clothes. This image, fueled by centuries of prejudice and by cinematic representations that are unfaithful to reality, does not stand up to a careful analysis of historical sources. Illuminated manuscripts produced throughout the Middle Ages show domestic scenes in which clothes are washed, hung out, and folded. The Rule of St. Benedict, dating from approximately 516, already mentions the washing of garments as part of the monastic routine. Ecclesiastical records, household inventories, and even religious sermons make constant reference to the act of washing clothes, often using laundry as a metaphor for the purification of the soul. People in medieval Europe did care about cleanliness. They desired to be as clean as their resources and technologies allowed. The fact that they did not possess washing machines, indoor plumbing, or industrialized soaps did not mean they lived oblivious to dirt. It simply meant that the cleaning process was infinitely more laborious, more time-consuming, and more physically demanding than anything we can imagine today. And it is this process that deserves to be examined closely. To understand how clothes were washed, it is first necessary to understand what they were made of. The composition of the textile fibers determined more than any other factor how a garment could be cleaned. The medieval textile world was radically different from ours. Synthetic fibers like polyester and nylon simply did not exist. Cotton, which today makes up the overwhelming majority of the clothes we wear, was not common in Europe until the 18th and 19th centuries. It could be obtained through trade with Southwest Asia and North Africa, but it was considered a luxury good, accessible only to the wealthiest. Silk, transported along the famous trade routes connecting Asia to Europe, was widely appreciated by those who could afford its high cost, but it remained out of reach for most of the population. There remained therefore two fibers that dominated the wardrobe of the common European: linen and wool. Wool was omnipresent. Robust, warm, and relatively affordable, it dressed peasants and nobles alike, though in very different qualities. However, wool has a characteristic that anyone who has ever tried to wash a wool sweater in a machine knows well: it shrinks. When exposed to hot water and soap, wool fibers contract and interlock in a process called felting, making the piece stiff, deformed, and, in practice, unusable. People in the Middle Ages were perfectly aware of this phenomenon. Although they did not have washing machines, they knew that wool did not tolerate aggressive washing with hot water and alkaline substances. Linen, on the other hand, was an extraordinarily versatile fiber for hygiene purposes. Obtained from the flax plant, it could be washed repeatedly without suffering significant damage. After the first wash, it practically did not shrink anymore. With use and successive washings, linen fabric became progressively softer, more comfortable, and more pleasant to the touch, without losing its strength. Furthermore, linen possessed remarkable absorption properties. It was superior to cotton in its ability to absorb sweat and body oils. A linen garment worn against the body could be used 2 or 3 times before needing to be washed, while an equivalent cotton garment would become uncomfortable and smelly by the end of a single day of use. This fundamental difference between linen and wool gave rise to a system of dress that spanned the entire Middle Ages and persisted until the early decades of the 20th century. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. Wear a layer of washable fabric directly against the skin to protect the outer layers, which were harder to clean. In practice, this meant that the first piece of clothing a medieval person put on in the morning was made of linen. For women, this was a long and wide shirt, often called a chemise, or, in medieval English, a smock. For men, a similar shirt, usually accompanied by braise, a type of undershort also made of linen. These undergarments covered the body much more extensively than modern underwear. They extended from the shoulders to below the knees, covering the arms and torso, and their primary function was to absorb sweat, natural skin oils, and any bodily dirt before these elements could reach the outer layers of wool. Over these linen pieces, wool clothes were worn: dresses, tunics, surcoats, cloaks. Since the wool did not come into direct contact with the skin, it stayed clean for much longer, requiring only occasional and sporadic care. This layering system explains something that often puzzles modern observers: why the so-called undergarments of past eras covered more of the body than many contemporary outer garments. The answer lies in the protective function of these pieces. They were not thought of in terms of modesty or aesthetics, but as practical hygiene barriers designed to be washed regularly and vigorously while preserving the more expensive outer clothing. In medieval Europe, linen was not used only for personal garments. It was the standard material for practically every textile that came into contact with the human body: towels, napkins, bed sheets, coifs, and head coverings. A household inventory from 1337, belonging to Hugh le Bever, a tavern owner in London, lists 7 linen sheets among his possessions. These 7 sheets together were valued at an amount higher than the value of a quilt decorated with fine silk. This data is revealing. In an era when fabrics represented a significant portion of a family's wealth, linen, despite being more affordable than silk, was valued for its durability and practical utility. Good linen sheets lasted for years, possibly decades, becoming softer and more comfortable with each wash. They were an investment that paid off over time. Having understood the central role of linen in medieval domestic life, we can now examine what it meant in practice to wash these pieces. It is important to note that written sources on laundry procedures during the medieval period are relatively scarce, especially in the centuries prior to the 15th. This is due, in part, to the nature of literary production at the time. Books were rare and expensive, and the themes considered worthy of record tended to be religious, political, or philosophical, not domestic. With the invention of the movable type printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, book production became more accessible and practical themes began to be recorded more frequently. Many of the written instructions on laundry date from the late Middle Ages or the early modern period, but researchers such as Drea Lead have demonstrated that these methods described in the 15th and 16th centuries were based on techniques that had been practiced for centuries. Curiously, some of the most vivid medieval descriptions of the act of washing clothes do not come from domestic manuals, but from religious texts. Preachers and ecclesiastical writers used laundry as a powerful metaphor for repentance and spiritual purification. The personification of penance in some texts appears offering or threatening to wash the sinner's soul, as if that soul were a dirty sheet that needed to be scrubbed, beaten, and bleached. The choice of metaphor was not accidental, Washing clothes in the Middle Ages was a process that involved a considerable dose of physical violence against the fabric. In the medieval domestic routine, laundry was divided into at least 3 distinct categories of care. The first was the spot cleaning of wool and silk pieces, which involved localized stain removal techniques without submerging the entire garment in water. The second was the regular washing of small amounts of linen clothing, such as undergarments, which could be done relatively frequently in the domestic environment. The third, and most impressive, was the so-called Great Wash, an extensive and laborious process of deep cleaning all the linen textiles in a residence, performed every several weeks, and which could consume an entire day or even more. Let us begin with the regular washing of small quantities, the medieval equivalent of putting underwear in the machine. Even for this seemingly simple task, the effort required was considerable. Medieval Europe did not have indoor plumbing, with the exception of some royal palaces and large ecclesiastical buildings. For the overwhelming majority of the population, water had to be fetched from a well, spring, or stream and transported manually to the washing site. If the washing was done at home, a large wooden tub or a metal pot was used as a container. The water had to be heated over the fire, which required gathering firewood and building and maintaining a fire. As for cleaning products, there were several options available, each with its advantages and disadvantages. The most accessible was lye, an alkaline solution obtained by filtering water through wood ashes. This process was simple and could be performed by anyone with access to a fireplace and a container. The resulting lye was effective in dissolving fats and dirt, although it could be harsh on the hands of those who handled it without protection. Another option was soapwort, a plant of the Caryophyllaceae family, whose leaves and roots, when agitated in water, produced a gentle foam with detergent properties. Soapwort was gentle enough to be used for cleaning delicate fabrics without damaging them, and it was cultivated in domestic and monastic gardens throughout Europe. Soap itself was also available, although its quality varied enormously depending on the geographic region and the purchasing power of the buyer. In regions near the Mediterranean, where olive oil was abundant, soap was produced based on olive oil and a local type of potash that resulted in solid, colorless bars gentle enough to be used for personal bathing. This soap was of superior quality and higher cost. For those who lived further north or had fewer resources, the alternative was liquid soap manufactured by combining lye with animal fat. This product was considerably harsher and could have a dark, almost black coloration. More refined versions, white in color, cost more and were less likely to stain fabrics. The more aggressive formulations could cause chemical burns on the hands of professional laundresses who handled them daily. Early modern recipe books describe adding ingredients like alum or eggs to soap to adapt it to specific types of fabrics or stains. In addition to the use of chemical agents, medieval washing also employed mechanical methods to remove dirt. Clothes could be rubbed against rough surfaces, similar to later washboards, trodden with the feet inside tubs of water or beaten vigorously with wooden bats. Rinsing was done with clean water, and excess moisture was removed by wringing the fabric by hand, since mangles, mechanical devices for squeezing water from fabrics, had not yet been invented. After that, the clothes were hung outdoors to dry, placed on ropes or spread over bushes and fences, or, when the weather did not cooperate, arranged in front of the fireplace inside the house. Drying time was several hours, and the result depended heavily on weather conditions. In short, to perform the medieval equivalent of a simple load of underwear in the washing machine, it was necessary to transport several buckets of water, light and maintain a fire, prepare or acquire cleaning products, scrub and beat each piece individually, wring the wet fabric with one's own hands, hang everything to dry, and wait patiently, hoping that the weather would remain steady. All this effort with one's own hands, without any mechanical assistance. If the regular washing of small quantities already demanded so much work, the Great Wash was an undertaking of truly epic proportions, and it is perfectly understandable why most medieval households performed it only every several weeks, or even every few months. This was a process of deep cleaning and bleaching of all the linen textiles in a residence, carried out all at once to justify the immense effort involved. White linen, despite its durability, tended to acquire a greyish or yellowish tone with continuous use, even when washed regularly. The Great Wash aimed not only to clean, but to restore the original whiteness of the fabrics, eliminating persistent stains, accumulated grease, and microorganisms. The process began with a prolonged pre-treatment of the pieces. Clothes and domestic textiles were immersed in a bleaching solution and left to soak for many hours, sometimes overnight. The substance used for this pre-treatment could be the wood ash lye already described, or even more surprisingly, ammonia obtained from fermented urine. The idea may seem repulsive to modern sensibilities, but it was a perfectly practical and logical solution. Human urine, when left to sit for a period, ferments and releases ammonia, an effective bleaching and degreasing agent. This method was free, unlike soap and other products that had to be bought or manufactured, and it was used not only in domestic laundry, but also in the professional textile industry, where fullers used urine and clay to degrease and prepare newly woven fabrics. Ammonia and lye, combined with the heat of the water, were capable of bleaching stains and accumulated yellowing, dissolving grease and encrusted dirt, and eliminating microorganisms. Medieval people may not have understood the science behind these processes in the way we understand it today, but it was not necessary to understand the mechanism to recognize the effectiveness of the result. They knew, through experience accumulated over generations, that certain procedures worked, and that was enough. The Nuremberg Kunstbuch, a manual produced in the 15th century for the nuns of the Dominican convent of St. Catherine in Nuremberg, contains more than a dozen recipes for cleaning varied items, from common clothes to highly valuable religious garments. This convent, founded in 1295, was an active center of textile production and manuscript copying. For washing underdresses, the instructions directed that 3 measures of ash be taken, placed in a large open container, over which boiling water was poured first, and then cold water until the vessel was full. The solution was to be strained through a cloth, and the garment was dipped in this lye and washed when it cooled, as hot water would turn the fabric yellow. The dirtiest areas, such as collars and sleeves, were to be rubbed directly with soap. Once the pre-treatment was finished, came the most physically demanding part of the process, transporting the soaking and heavy clothes to a running watercourse. Rivers, streams, communal fountains, or public washhouses were the destinations, but they were not always nearby. Wet clothes are extraordinarily heavy, and there are medieval illuminations showing 2 servants carrying a single laundry basket between them. Such was the load. Washing clothes in a river presented its own dangers. In winter, the water was freezing, and the banks could be covered in ice, making them slippery and dangerous. Rivers that ran through cities often received domestic and industrial pollution, and the risk of falling into the current was real and constant. The Hôtel Dieu of Paris, the oldest hospital in the city, founded around the year 651 on the Ile de la Cité next to Notre Dame Cathedral, employed a boatman specifically designated to rescue laundresses who fell into the Seine River during flood tides. But even covered washing spaces were not safe. A record dating from 1276 documents the death of a laundress named Emma, who died after falling into a lead tank full of boiling water. Emma's tragedy was not an isolated case, but a reflection of the risks inherent in a profession that combined aggressive chemicals, high-temperature water, and extreme physical effort. Once the clothes were transported to the river or stream, the washing process itself began. The pre-treated pieces were placed on stones or wooden blocks at the water's edge and literally thrashed with large wooden bats. This act of beating the clothes against hard surfaces served the same purpose as the agitation cycle of modern washing machines. The mechanical action helped to loosen dirt particles from the fabric fibers, allowing the running water to carry them away. The laundresses struck the fabrics repeatedly, with vigor and precision, in a rhythmic work that required strength in the arms, endurance in the back, and a technique developed by practice. Once the beating was finished, the clothes were rinsed in the running water and wrung to remove excess moisture. Without mangles or centrifuges, wringing was done entirely by hand, or in some cases, by wrapping the fabrics around a vertical post called a wringing post. The documentary series Tales from the Green Valley, which reconstructs life on an early modern farm, demonstrates this technique. The participants wring the laundry around a post to squeeze out the water, a method that historical records indicate was used in places like Moorfields, an area on the outskirts of London where 16th-century maps show laundry activities being carried out. The final stage of the Great Wash was drying, and this phase could be, paradoxically, one of the most problematic of the entire process. The clean and wrung clothes were taken back and spread out in the open air, ideally under direct sunlight. Exposure to the sun not only dried the fabrics, but provided an additional round of natural bleaching, as ultraviolet radiation bleached residual stains and eliminated microorganisms. The grass itself upon which the fabrics were laid contributed to the process, since the oxygen released by the plants acted as a gentle bleaching agent. Medieval communities often maintained common areas for drying clothes, known as bleaching fields. Clothes could also be spread over lavender bushes to absorb the plant's aroma, and it is likely that the word lavender itself derives from the Old French lavandre, in turn originating from the Latin lavar, meaning to wash. However, air drying depended entirely on the cooperation of the weather. If the weather changed and rain arrived before the clothes were completely dry, the result was disastrous. Pieces stored while still damp would develop mold, becoming unusable and potentially damaging other items stored with them. For the medieval housewife or laundress, weather forecasting was a vital, though imprecise, skill. The medieval book known as the Distaff Gospels mentions the practice of praying to St. Clare for good weather, or observing the behavior of cats as a sign of imminent rain. Large institutions like the Hôtel Dieu of Paris, which according to records washed more than 500 sheets per week, could have covered spaces for hanging clothes in winter. But the Hôtel Dieu was enormous, with 15 full-time workers. The average housewife did not have this luxury and depended entirely on meteorological luck. The theft of clothes during drying was another recurring problem. Fabrics represented a significant economic value in the Middle Ages, and pieces spread out in the open air in open fields were tempting targets for opportunistic thieves. Professional laundresses, who would be held responsible if any item belonging to their clients disappeared, protected the clothes under their care with ferocity. A stone sculpture on the ceiling of Norwich Cathedral in England depicts a laundress chasing away a thief, an image that should not be underestimated. Women who spent their days beating clothes with wooden bats, carrying heavy baskets, and wringing soaked fabrics were physically formidable, and the prospect of facing a medieval laundress armed with her washing bat probably deterred many potential thieves. This entire Herculean process explains why many families, if they had some financial resources, preferred to hire a professional to do the laundry. And here we enter a fascinating and complex aspect of medieval social history, the profession of the laundress and all that it represented in terms of gender, social class, and stigma. Due to the rigid gender norms that permeated medieval European society, laundry was classified unequivocally as women's work. This classification was at once limiting and, paradoxically, liberating. Limiting because it confined women to a physically exhausting and socially devalued activity. Liberating because laundry was one of the few occupations by which a medieval woman could earn her own living, regardless of her marital status. Single women, widows, married women in need of extra income, all could work as laundresses. There were rare exceptions to the rule of female exclusivity. Some male monastic orders assigned laundry to the monks themselves, either for fear that the presence of women represented temptation, or because women were not considered holy enough to handle liturgical garments. However, in the overwhelming majority of cases, those who washed clothes were women. The employment conditions of laundresses varied enormously. Those who served in royal or aristocratic households could enjoy a relatively privileged position. A laundress of the English royal court could receive a salary of 1 shilling per week, in addition to lodging, food, clothing, and, in some cases, even a retirement plan. Matilda de Housekai, a royal laundress documented in records from 1317, received lodging and sustenance at Westminster Abbey when she became too old to continue working. This is an early form of social security for a low-status worker, something remarkable in an era that offered no formal safety net for most workers. Most laundresses, however, worked as freelancers. They maintained a regular clientele, similar to the operation of a modern small business, and could be paid in various ways, by an annual or weekly stipend, by laundry load, by individual piece, or even by exchange of services and products. Financial records on the remuneration of laundresses are fragmentary and sparse, but the available data indicates that the usual rate for the regular laundress of a religious institution revolved around 4 shillings per year, plus small occasional bonuses. Individual clients of high social standing, such as an official of Westminster Abbey, could pay between 2 and 4 shillings per year, or apparently double in the case of a monk, possibly because the payment was calculated per piece of clothing. For comparison, highly skilled craftsmen such as stonemasons and glaziers received 3 to 4 pence per day during this same period. A laundress who managed to accumulate several important clients could obtain a reasonable income, but the average laundress probably earned much less and with much less stability. Tellingly, the wages of laundresses did not keep pace with the general wage increases that occurred in almost all other sectors of the economy after the Black Death, the pandemic that from 1347 onwards eliminated between 1/3 and 1/2 of the European population. The resulting labor shortage led to wage increases in practically every profession, but laundresses were largely excluded, reflecting the low social status of the profession and the systematic devaluation of female labor. The social marginalization of laundresses went far beyond the issue of wages. The very exercise of the profession exposed these women to moral judgments and stigmatization that revealed deeply disturbing aspects of medieval gender norms. To avoid soaking their own clothes during work, laundresses rolled up their sleeves above their elbows and lifted their skirts above their knees or even their thighs, exposing arms and legs in a society that considered such female exposure unseemly or provocative. Furthermore, laundresses moved freely through the city to collect and deliver clothes, often unaccompanied by men, and gathered in groups at washing sites, also without male supervision. They were often the only women linked to large male groups, such as noble houses, armies on campaign, and monastic communities. The medieval mentality, confronted with women who exposed their bodies, moved with freedom, and lived in proximity to men, decided that laundry could not be a sufficient explanation for all of this. The term laundress became, in many contexts, a euphemism for sex worker. This defamatory association was not based on the reality of most laundresses, but on deeply ingrained gender prejudices that treated the mere existence of independent women as something intrinsically suspicious and morally doubtful. The situation was aggravated by the fact that women who were already considered socially suspicious for being poor, single, or both, and women who actually performed sex work often also worked as laundresses because it was one of the only forms of livelihood accessible to them. Rejected by religious-based charities such as hospices and almshouses, which imposed rigorous moral criteria for admission, these women developed mutual support networks outside established structures. A documented case in 1270s Paris involves a migrant worker named Nicole de Roubercy, who suffered a medical crisis that made her unable to work. Unable to turn to formal social assistance services, Nicole was supported during her recovery by other women of low social status, in an example of solidarity among the most marginalized in medieval society. Thus was formed an informal but resilient network of physically robust, economically independent women, endowed with their own support systems and operating outside patriarchal control. For the medieval social order, built on female subordination, this reality was deeply uncomfortable. Laundresses who served in royal or aristocratic houses generally escaped moral suspicion but could find themselves involved in political intrigue. A laundress who handled the sheets and undergarments of powerful figures had access to potentially explosive information. Whether her mistress had received nocturnal visitors, whether she was menstruating normally, or had not menstruated for several months, information that, in the case of queens and princesses, could have dynastic implications. It would not be surprising if this involuntary intimacy with the secrets of the powerful was the origin of the expression dirty laundry. Leaving the world of linen and professional laundresses, let us now return to the fabrics that could not be subjected to this rigorous treatment: wool and silk. As already mentioned, wool did not tolerate contact with soap and hot water well, and silk, used by the wealthier classes for ceremonial and prestige clothing, was even more delicate. An occasional rinse in cold water caused no harm to most wool pieces, but even this simple operation presented risks. The dyes used in the Middle Ages did not have the same setting as modern ones, and a wash, even in cold water, could cause the colors of the fabric to fade. In a society where bright and saturated colors were synonymous with wealth, as intense dyes cost significantly more, the fading of a piece was equivalent to a visible loss of status and economic value. The predominant solution for the maintenance of wool and silk clothes was spot cleaning, in which only the stained area received treatment, without the entire piece being wetted or immersed. Several books from the late Middle Ages and the early modern period contain detailed recipes for these localized treatments. The instructions often direct the reader to apply the cleaning solution repeatedly over the specific stain, rather than washing the entire piece. One of the most detailed books in this regard is the late 14th century domestic treatise known as the Goodman of Paris, often translated as the Good Wife's Guide. This text, supposedly written by an elderly Parisian husband for his young 15-year-old wife, was conceived as a complete manual for domestic administration, covering topics ranging from cooking and social behavior to the care of fine clothes. Although it does not stoop to deal with something as mundane as the washing of linen, the Goodman of Paris devotes considerable attention to the cleaning of high-quality wool and silk pieces. Verjuice, a highly acidic liquid obtained from the juice of green grapes or other acidic fruits, is a frequently recommended treatment for stains. For rich silk fabrics, the author directs to soak and wash the stain with verjuice, stating that the stain will disappear. Such was the confidence in the effectiveness of this product that the author advises keeping verjuice always at hand, describing it as useful for removing stains from dresses and restoring their colors, and reliable both fresh and aged. Lye solutions, often prepared with ashes from specific types of wood to obtain different alkaline concentrations, were also widely used for spot cleaning. The Nuremberg Kunstbuch recommends them specifically for green-colored clothes, while the Goodman of Paris suggests soaking ashes or chicken feathers in lye and rubbing the stains with this preparation. More stubborn cases, the lye solution could be reinforced with lime, an intensely alkaline and significantly more aggressive substance. Soapwort also found application in the care of fine fabrics. The English book from the Tudor period, entitled A Profitable Book, states that fabrics of scarlet or velvet, of any color or type, can be spot cleaned with the juice of soapwort without altering their colors. It is worth noting that, at that time, the word scarlet designated not a color, but a specific type of high-quality wool fabric. Absorbent ingredients like fuller's earth, clay, and bone powder were recommended for the removal of oil or grease stains, working by absorbing the grease from the fabric without the need to dissolve it with aggressive chemicals. There is, however, one point where the medieval system of wearing washable linen against the body and spot-cleaning wool clothes presented an obvious flaw: the hose. In medieval Europe, hose, as they were called, were generally sewn from woven wool fabric and not knitted like modern socks. If they were washed in the same way as linens, with hot water and soap, the wool fibers would felt and the hose would become unusable. However, wool naturally possesses antimicrobial properties that slow the development of odors. Observations on the use of modern wool socks suggest that they can be worn for several consecutive days before needing to be washed, unlike cotton socks, which become uncomfortable after a single day. It is reasonable to assume that an owner of 2 or 3 pairs of wool hose who aired them between uses and washed them occasionally with cold water and one of the gentlest cleaning products available could maintain a perfectly acceptable level of foot hygiene. This realization leads us to a broader reflection. The medieval system of layers of linen over wool, far from being primitive, was an ingenious and functionally superior solution in several respects to the modern habit of wearing cotton directly against the skin, as cotton absorbs less moisture, retains odors more easily, and needs to be washed more frequently. Medieval people were no less intelligent than we are. They worked with the materials and technologies available and developed practical, sophisticated, and effective solutions for the challenges of their daily lives. The history of medieval laundry is, ultimately, a story of human ingenuity in the face of material limitations, of empirical knowledge accumulated over generations, and of extraordinary physical labor performed mostly by women whose names have been forgotten by history. It is also a story that confronts us with the reality that tasks we consider trivial were, not long ago, undertakings that consumed entire days, involved real health risks, and depended on technical skills and physical endurance that we hardly associate with the simple word laundry. Looking at this entire panorama, one thing becomes clear. Medieval laundry was possibly as difficult as popular imagination suggests. In many other aspects of medieval life, myths exaggerate the horrors and obscure the sophistications. But in the specific case of laundry, the facts confirm the reputation. Washing clothes in medieval Europe was brutal, physically devastating work, chemically dangerous, and totally dependent on external factors like the weather. The women who performed this work faced not only physical exhaustion, but also social stigma, the pejorative association with prostitution, and exclusion from formal protection mechanisms. And yet many of them found in this profession a measure of economic independence, built mutual support networks, and defended their livelihoods with fierce determination. The next time we find ourselves postponing the task of taking the clothes out of the washing machine, perhaps it is worth remembering that we are only a few centuries away from a world where this same task meant waking up before dawn, carrying buckets of water from a well, lighting fires, preparing homemade chemical solutions, beating clothes against stones in a freezing river, wringing soaked fabrics with one's own hands, and praying that it would not rain. We do not need to feel guilty for complaining about modern laundry, but we can feel gratitude for the fact that our process does not involve strenuous physical labor, chemical burns, or fermented urine. And we can look back at the past not with condescension, but with respect for the extraordinary human capacity to solve problems and preserve dignity even in the most adverse circumstances. History was not uniformly better, nor uniformly worse than the present. Each era has its triumphs and its difficulties. The medieval past deserves to be understood on its own terms, without the arrogance of those who judge retrospectively from the comfort of technologies that our ancestors could not even imagine. If this journey through the world of medieval laundry has piqued your curiosity, if you have learned something you did not know, or if you have begun to look at your washing machine with new eyes, consider subscribing to this channel to follow more documentary narratives like this one, which explore the fascinating and often surprising details of everyday life in other times. Leave your comment telling us which modern domestic task you are most grateful not to have to perform. The old-fashioned way. And don't forget to like this content so that more people can discover the extraordinary stories hidden behind the most common activities of our daily lives. Until the next narrative.